Spotlighting Hawaii's leaders.
We want to bring in Governor David E.
Good morning, Mr. Mayor.
Lieutenant Governor, good morning. Thanks so much for joining us. Mayor Derek Kawakami.
Thank you so much, Senator, for being here.
Spotlighting the issues.
Where is the virus right now in our community?
How much is this overall going to cost the state?
How are you responding to the community's concerns? Talk about the level of citations that you guys are writing.
Spotlight Hawaii with Yanji Denise and Ryan Kalei Suji on the digital platforms of the Honolulu Star-Advertiser.
This episode of Spotlight Hawaii is brought to you by Long's Drugs.
Well, good morning. Thanks for joining us on this Wednesday morning. I'm Ryan Kalei Suji, joined by Yanji Denise, and this is Spotlight Hawaii on the digital platforms of the Honolulu Star-Advertiser. And as I watch that open, I realized we're going to have to change that open because we're going to have some new elected leaders in office as the dust settles from last night's general election. And this morning, we are shining the spotlight on what happened last night.
Yeah, if you were up late like us watching those printouts, then you'll appreciate our two guests this morning. We are joined live this morning by Neal Milner and Colin Moore. Of course, two political powerhouses who know this stuff inside and out. Neal, let's start with you, just broad strokes. What are your impressions of what happened last night?
Well, I think top of the ticket, what happened was what anybody knew was going to happen, basically, which was that it was going to be all Democratic. There wasn't really much serious opposition at all. The percentage of the votes is about what you would expect. And that moved pretty predictably. The real fights in those elections, to the extent there were in the governor's race, were in the primary. This was a kind of necessary afterthought. There were some other things here and there, a few other races that were competitive, some Republican inroads in legislative seats. But if you look at the overall result of this, and let's just start there because we can get into the little pieces later, the Democrats still overwhelmingly control the legislature. That's not surprising. The top of the ticket is all Democratic. That's not surprising. And the turnout was low, which may surprise some people who think that the mail-in ballot is going to make this huge difference. But it doesn't make that much difference, partially because what I said about the way this election was working. If the election is pretty dull, if the election covers the ground that is sort of listless, then there isn't going to be a great incentive for people who normally don't vote to vote. That's a lot like a lot of elections here.
And Colin, I want to get your thoughts on what happened last night. Were you surprised by the voter turnout, and was there anything else that was somewhat surprising to you?
Well, this is one of the quietest general elections that I can remember. I barely even saw anyone sign waving. So I wasn't surprised that turnout was low. I was surprised, though, that it was as low as it was. It was 41%, and maybe that'll tick up just a little bit when we get that last printout, but not very much. So just to give you a sense of how low that is, the lowest voter turnout in Hawaii's history for a general election was in 2014, and that was about 53%. So not only was it low in a low turnout state generally, it was much, much lower than we've had in the past. So I think this will go down in our record as the lowest voter, general election turnout we've ever had. Like Neal said, there were a couple of interesting things. You heard a lot about the red wave that never materialized on the mainland. We had a little bit of a red wave here. It looks like the Republicans, who had 4 seats in the state house, might end up with 6 seats in the state house. And this is notable because 2 of their members, Val Okimoto and Bob McDermott, actually retired. So just to stay even, the Republicans had to pick up 2 seats. And it looks like they might pick up 4. So by the standards of Republicans in Hawaii, that's pretty good news for them.
Well, let's talk about some of those House races since we're there. We did see 2 members that were plagued with similar scandals in Matt Lopresti and Sharon Har. Those races haven't been called yet. At this hour, Lopresti's separated from his opponent by nearly 1,000 votes. The Har race is much closer, 142 separating them, with the Republican leading there at this hour. What do you think about those 2 races in particular and what happened with those candidates?
Well, I think everyone knew that Lopresti and Har were in danger, partly because they were arrested under suspicion for DUI, also because their districts changed during the reapportionment process. So basically, the introduction that a lot of voters had to Lopresti and Har was, all of this bad news about being arrested, for suspicion of DUI. That's never good for any politician. And so they were always going to struggle. When you are struggling, when you're known as a vulnerable incumbent, it also attracts higher quality challengers. And I think both of them did have pretty high quality challengers. David Alcos is a contractor well known in the community. Diamond Garcia, who was challenging Sharon Har, was the vice chair of the Republican Party. So they were vulnerable incumbents. I think the two more surprising pickups that I didn't see coming were districts right in that same area. We're talking about West Side districts for all of these. It looks like Corey Rosenlee, who is the former head of HSTA, and anytime you're involved in unions, that gives you a big boost in our local elections, might lose to a relatively unknown hospital chaplain, Elijah Pierik, who did get a lot of support from the evangelical community and others like Councilman Augie Tolba, but still, it's surprising when someone who has those kind of union connections loses. And then there's a Senate race that we haven't talked about, maybe Neal will, that's still probably too close to call. Incumbent Gil Riviere might lose to Britton Awal, though we're still waiting for those results.
Yeah, before we get to that, Neal, I want to get your thoughts on this mini Republican wave that's happening, a pink wave, maybe, if you will, on the west side of the island. Because when you look at the other races and the other seats there, I mean, Andrea Tupola represents the city council. On that side, clearly a Republican in a nonpartisan position. But what can that say about what's happening on the west side of the island now that we're seeing some of these Republicans finding an opportunity there?
Well, the first thing to say is that nearby has been, by Oahu standards, kind of Republican. It's competitive. That is the Eva Kapolei area. And so there's been some action there. They don't win all the time, and this time the scandal is going to hurt them. I think what it might be saying, there's a couple of things that I think are going on. One of which is that they found good candidates. And as I said before, and Colin alluded to this, there was some strategy, some money, not big money, but by Republican standards, some strategic money that went into the campaign against Corey. I think, though, that one of the reasons we're surprised by that race with Corey Rosenlee is because we didn't know very much about it. We didn't know very much about it because the media doesn't cover these kinds of things. There's a kind of a set of assumptions that are made. It's Democratic. He's a labor guy. No one has been talking very critically about him in the public, so he should do all right. My guess is that if we had followed that campaign, if we had been more embedded in it, it wouldn't have surprised us as much.
And let's stay with you on that district. I believe it's State House District 23, or Senate District, rather. This Gil Riviere and Brenton Awa race now separated by less than 200 votes. Still too close to call. But what do you make of it? You have a relative political newcomer in Mr. Awa, of course, a former news personality. So definitely some name recognition there. But the incumbent also, pretty strong, and that's not his first time winning over there. So what are your thoughts on that particular race, Neal?
Well, Brenton was telling me all along, because I know in the past that I essentially may be right about the rest of the Republicans, but he was going to win that district. He worked very hard. He's a smart guy. As a media guy, he's like that. The district is very weird. I mean, it's geographically very weird. And so there are these little pockets in there that have been Republican. I think of all of I think that the race that we just talked about, and then this race, ought to be the most important, encouraging things about Republicans. That is, in places where they really haven't done well in the past, at least in the recent past, if you work hard and you get a good candidate, you at least have a shot. I mean, to say that kind of thing, you're pretty much ruling out a good portion of Oahu, where it's very hard for Republicans to get more than 30%. But it may be that there's something to learn from those two campaigns, one of which is some strategic money, not much, and the second, that it's still possible, even for one of the most one-party states in the country, for somebody to win if, in fact, they're attractive and they work hard. The secret is to get candidates like that to run again. Now, the winning one in the other district up near Waipahu, it's not much of a disincentive. He'll run again probably. But to get someone like Brenton to run again, even if he loses, that's how the party can be built. And what you have is, the Republicans did a good job of filling space. They had a lot of candidates, more than usual. But the secret is not how many you have the first time running, but how many will repeat now that they're more experienced.
I want to kind of stick on that North Shore area as we move into the city council races. One of the races that many were watching was the city council District 2 between Wire and Rothman. Neal, your thoughts on that race and how it panned out, and some of the other council races and how things shook out there?
Well, I thought that would be closer. Colin?
I'm sorry, Colin.
either one of us.
Well,
I agree with Neal. I thought that would be closer too. I mean, Makua Rothman had the advantage of celebrity. That we know that tends to be a more conservative area, one of the few conservative areas of Oahu, other than the West Side. And so when you're talking about those down ticket races and you're already well known, that gives you a huge boost. Matt Wire is a high quality candidate. He's a city administrator. He has worked in politics in a variety of different ways in his career, but he didn't have that immediate name recognition. He was backed by many of the unions, and that always helps. I mean, those networks can also be equally powerful when you're talking about down ticket races that folks don't pay as much attention to. But I too was surprised at how big of a gap there was. I thought if Wire won, it would be very narrow, much like it was in the primary, because this was Heidi Suniyoshi's district. Of course, it's changed a little bit after reapportionment, but it's still a pretty conservative district, and Matt Wire is more or less a progressive.
Well, Neal, let's talk about another city council race, that between Val Okimoto and Ron Menor for Brandon Elefante's seat, which of course he's moving on to the legislature now that he's termed out at the council. He won that race last night. What are your thoughts? You have Ron Menor there, a very, well-known politician in the community, a former city council member, versus Val Okimoto, who had just served one term at the legislature. So relatively inexperienced when it comes to politics, but still having a victory under her belt. You can't deny the power of that. What do you make of that race?
Well, I think that I see her as relatively experienced because she's done it before. She knows how to run it. She probably had a network of people ready to go and support her. I wonder if you finally reach a point where, as an experienced candidate with a long political history and a name that's well known politically, if you don't finally jump the shark. If there's an attractive candidate running against you, someone who's experienced, who knows how to do this in a district that's part of which is fairly, let's say, Republican or conservative, maybe that had something to do with it, that Ron Menor had been around for a long time. They had another fresh face here. She was a fresh face, but she had an experience as a campaign. That may have been enough to make the difference.
Let's switch islands now. Colin, I want to get your thoughts on what happened on Maui. There was, of course, a lot of talk about Mike Victorino being in jeopardy of losing that seat. We saw that happen last night, the incumbent mayor being voted out of office. Your thoughts on just this race overall, and if there was any surprise there at how much of a difference there was in the overall election results?
I was a little less surprised with this result than some people. Of course, it's always rare in Hawaii for an incumbent mayor to lose their bid for re-election. But there were some unique things, I think, going on in this Maui mayoral race. I mean, Maui is an interesting case because it is a very ideologically divided community and a very well-mobilized community. So you have a group of progressives who recently have been able to exercise quite a bit of power on the county council, in many cases opposing Mayor Victorino. They passed this moratorium on resort development that was quite controversial. But the key thing there is that they've been very organized. Now, the surprise coming out of the primary was that Kelly King, a progressive, didn't advance to the general election. And so you had Rick Bisson and Mike Victorino. It was pretty clear that the progressives weren't going to back Victorino because they've clashed so many times with him in the past. And I actually thought Rick Bisson ran a pretty smart campaign. I mean, he basically came in as, the respected judge who was above the fray. A lot of his proposals were pretty light on policy details. I think that was likely strategic. He's clearly a very smart person. But I think he was trying to present himself as an alternative to these factions that it looks like folks on Maui were quite sick of. The other thing I'll say about Victorino is he had a really tough 4 years as mayor. I mean, a big part of his time as mayor was trying to manage the COVID crisis. And we know there was resistance from a variety of folks on Maui, from, in some cases, folks on the left, folks on the right, that he took a lot of that blame for. And then he was really pummeled by progressives. So when it ended with running against Bisson, he didn't have a lot of places to go for votes because the progressives were backing Bisson largely. A lot of the trades and other unions like HGA were backing Bisson. And so he was sort of stuck. And, 40% of the vote is about what I expected he was going to get. And that's what it looks like he's going to end up with.
Neal, you mentioned the importance of candidates who run a first time, going back in there, even if they haven't lost, and running a second time. You really see that lesson with the last city council race that we didn't talk about. And that was Carol Fukunaga's seat. Of course, she is going on to the ledge now because she's termed out there as well. But Tracy Toguchi, who was her chief of staff, going up against Tyler Dos Santos Tam, who had challenged Carol Fukunaga previously, and then coming back again and winning that race. What do you take away from that city council race?
Well, I think you had two good candidates. I think Tyler had the advantage of sort of a political party identification that really makes a difference there. I think what that district has been a problem before if you don't like dissension, because there's been a lot of dissension there. That, again, I think had to do as much with having two good candidates there and one just being a little bit better with a little bit more support and stronger support from Democratic Party stalwarts that really did make a difference. I think you're going to see, if you want to see someone that thinks about having a political future, I think the losing candidate there will certainly be back. Whether she'll come back in a partisan way, I don't know. And of course, once again, Carol Fukunaga continues to find an office in the political process. I think how many is it now? She's been around for a long time.
At least since the 78 Con.
Yeah, that's right. Since I was going to say, I'm always reluctant to say as long as I've been here, because that's become something like a century. But but I know it's been that long, and it shows. I mean, this is an interesting thing because it shows the effects of term limits. I'm not talking at all about competence here. That what happens when you're term limited, it doesn't mean you disappear from the political face of the earth. You find something else to do, and she's always been highly respected among politicians and among legislators. So, and now she's not term limited anymore.
Yeah, she's back in the Senate. Let's go to the top of the ticket. Of course, no real surprise there with, of course, now Governor-elect Josh Green and his Lieutenant Governor and running mate Sylvia Luke moving into the 5th floor of the Hawaii State Capitol. They have a few weeks to get things going and organized. But Neal, want to get your just thoughts overall on the Green campaign and that race between Iona and Green.
Well, here's the thing. If you have an enormously high approval rating, if you have an enormous war chest, if you're an attractive speaker, and if you beat the challengers back, that gives you a huge advantage over the opposing candidate who had no money, who jumped in late, and who really didn't have all that much to offer that Republicans in the recent past, including him, have had to offer that hasn't been effective. All that is saying that Josh ran the kind of campaign that you run when you're pretty damn sure you're going to win. And that is that he got messages out there. He did what you had to do. He didn't want to debate. He wasn't ideological. He talked about his accomplishments. And so, yeah, it worked like a charm. But if you're a Democrat in a state like this, working like a charm isn't all that hard. All in all, I've been impressed by the way he handled it. But what I'm trying to say is that there wasn't much to challenge him to get him to handle it differently because of the war chest he could have used that he didn't use very much.
it's somewhat similar where the race was really fought in the primary is our new congressional delegate, Jill Takuda. Colin, what are your impressions of that campaign, how she ran it? Of course, she started out the political season running for LG and then switched course once Kaikahele made his intention for governor known. But just your takeaway on Hawaii having now a new member of Congress.
Sure. I mean, Jill Takuda won this in the primary, of course. Joe Akana, I don't think really had any money or much of a chance. She's going to enter Congress at an interesting time. I mean, it's going to be extremely narrowly divided. When you're a new member of Congress, you don't really have much power anyway. I mean, you're basically told, to sit in the corner and to vote the way the party does. And that there's been a lot of volatility in that CD2 race. Of course, that was Tulsi Gabbard's seat, and then it was Kaikahele's seat. So that's unusual in our delegation, where you have, not a lot of continuity. Two members, especially Tulsi Gabbard, who were outspoken and in many cases critical of their own party. Jill Takuda isn't going to follow that model. I'm almost certain. She is someone who I think loves being a legislator, which I don't think was really true of Tulsi Gabbard or Kaikahele. She loves the details of legislation. When she was in the Senate, she was sort of known for her mastery of the state budget. I think she's going to be there for a long time, unless, of course, a Senate seat opens up. I think she has wanted to serve in the U.S. Congress for most of her life. I really do think this is a dream come true for her, and I think she's going to be a very effective legislator. I mean, she comes from a background of coalition building in the state legislature. I think she's going to be a pretty good team player for the Democrats. I don't think she has a lot of interest in her own personal fame, unlike Tulsi Gabbard, for example. So I think she's going to be quite effective.
Let me just add one thing. I watched an interview last night with Ed Case when they asked the subject about Jill Takuda, and he said the usual thing about how much he respects her. But the other thing he basically said is, I'm going to mentor her real hard because this is a crucial time for the delegation. And I think that speaks to what Colin was saying, that this is this is a tough time, is a crucial time both for the Hawaii delegation, because once again, their dreams of seniority have taken a step back, but also what Congress is going to be like.
We'll want to take a look at what's just to come, I guess, in the next 4 years under this new administration with Josh Green. Colin, to get your thoughts. I mean, we are moving from an Ige administration that has sat on the fifth floor for 8 years and now moving in to Josh Green taking over, someone who has been by Ige's side for 4 years, but it's sort of the understudy, right? Not necessarily having to make those hard decisions. Now he's going to be placed in a situation where the buck stops with him, and he's going to have a hardline positioning on some of these things. Your thoughts with Josh Green as he enters into this executive role?
Well, it's going to be tough, and he's going to have a very short honeymoon. I mean, Green doesn't have a lot of executive experience. He was a legislator who then became LG, and there's almost no responsibilities as LG, and now he has to manage an entire state. So that's going to be a real challenge for him. I think that the partnership with Sylvia Luke is going to be essential, and I'm curious to see how long that partnership can maintain itself. If it's a strong one, Luke could be a tremendous asset to the Green administration, because I think her skills are in areas where Green is a little weaker. She is very detail oriented. She has a strong relationship with the members of the legislature. She knows how the legislature works. Of course, Green is much more outspoken. He's great at using the bully pulpit to try to shape public opinion. I think Luke is more of an insider deal maker. I want to go back to the point, though, I made about the short honeymoon, because, people have been very critical, of course, about Governor Ige and his, problems, his communication style. But I don't think that, Ige's problems are really just a result of that. I mean, people are really frustrated with the state of Hawaii, and the governor takes a lot of that blame. There's a reason Governor Ige was one of the least popular governors in America for much of his time during the last 4 years. And it's not because of, there certainly weren't any personal scandals. It's because people are frustrated with the inability of the state to help solve their problems, particularly around the cost of living and affordable housing. So Green doesn't have a whole lot of time before I think you're going to see his approval ratings start to go down in a pretty dramatic fashion. And so he needs some early wins. And some of those could be to try to fix the stadium, which I think is kind of a mess Ige is going to dump in his lap. And maybe some other early wins around affordable housing or homelessness. He really needs those because he doesn't have a lot of time. And if you end up being an unpopular governor, you're not going to have much pull at the legislature.
One of the speeches he gave last night, he talked about how he's going to take quick action, and it fit into a common theme that, of course, the Democrats used more last night because they had more opportunities for victory speeches. That is, the reason we do so well is because we have talented people, and it feeds into what I'm going to do, as the new governor says, is I'm going to take action quick. Candidates, winning candidates, individual politicians emphasize individual work. But you have to remember two things in Hawaii. One is the basic constitutional thing, which is separation of powers means you don't have that much control over that. The second thing is Hawaii operates slowly and inefficiently for long institutional reasons that went before Governor Ige and continued that way. So my concern, when you talk about quick action, there are certain things he's going to do. As soon as he said the word executive orders, I got a little bit suspicious because that's a sort of fallback position. All I'm saying is we have to remember that quick action anywhere by a politician, but particularly in Hawaii, can turn into something that is far more wished for than actually happens.
Okay, I want to have you both end on where we started, which is this voter turnout question. The state has made it so easy for people to vote, and yet the participation is pretty dismal. Just your parting thoughts this morning on what we saw in this race or this election in terms of the turnout and how we get more people to participate in this process. Neal, we'll start with you.
Well, I think that the turnout, I think you have to start with two fundamentals. One is Hawaii is a low turnout state. And what I mean by that is that there's a tradition and a habit there that's hard to break. The second thing is that we made it easier to vote. All mail is a great way to vote. This state was never all that hard, but what this shows is that there's something else that people need to get them to vote besides make it easy. And if you look at surveys about why people don't vote, a lot of them have to say, oh, we just don't pay attention to politics. It's too complicated. We haven't been following and so on. So there is a whole other set of variables there that prevent people from voting more. I think the significance in this race, there's two significances, and Colin and I have been messing around with this voter turnout thing for a few years now. One significance is that it's pretty low. It's very low. The other significant thing is that normally the average in other states is that the turnout jumps about 30% between a midterm and a general election. Here we didn't jump at all, basically. That suggests that the listlessness of the campaign of the general election was, and the interest in it wasn't very high. And because essentially the exciting decisions were made, top of the ticket, were made in the primaries.
I agree with what Neal said. I mean, one of the reasons we have low turnout is because there's very little to get excited about. There's very little that people feel is at stake. Hawaii actually has a pretty high turnout rate for primary elections compared to a lot of states, but we really kind of collapse in the general election, and you saw that last night. But I would say that in some ways this is because voters are rational. They know that there's a lot at stake here often in the primary, very little often at stake in the general. And so we need some ways to create more competition in more of our races. And that could include things like public financing. There's a variety of ways to try to create a little more competition and excitement. I think that if you weren't paying attention, it would be easy to have forgotten that there was a general election last night, given the lack of signs, advertising, sign waving, the normal things that accompany elections. So this is depressing, but not surprising. So my solution, in part, because we can't make it any easier to vote, is we need to find ways to increase the amount of competition in all of our races.
Well, it always is an enjoyable election season, being able to talk to both of you. Both, of course, Yunji and I have political science degrees, and so we love these types of this time of year and having these
Yet
types
you
of
got good
discussions.
jobs.
Yes,
Somehow it worked out. Who knows?
congratulations.
But we always enjoy this time and catching up with the two of you and just gleaning from your knowledge and experience in these races and just your commentary over the years. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you maybe in a few more years.
Sounds good.
Aloha.
Always great to hear from them. I love their analysis, and I particularly was interested in thinking about what the experience is going to be like for the new residents of the fifth floor at this Hawaii State Capitol. Colin Moore basically saying that the honeymoon will be brief for the current lieutenant governor, soon to be governor, and that really the recommendation, it sounds like from his analysis, is to use Sylvia Luke as a resource, because obviously she knows the legislature inside and out, particularly the budget and all the dynamics that go into making things happen, down in the Capitol. And so, just what we'll see, because, Josh Green was obviously, I don't want to say insubordinate, but definitely didn't always agree with David Ige. So will his lieutenant governor treat him the same way? We'll have to see how that goes.
And it's going to be a very crazy time for the the governor-elect now in Josh Green in trying to fill that cabinet and find the members that are going to work well with him. If you remember, one of the first controversies in the Ige administration was him trying to nominate Carlton Ching to his cabinet post that draw a lot of criticism within the legislature, and he ultimately lost that battle, naming Case into that role. But there is a lot of challenges ahead. He has to plan an inauguration in 2 weeks, and as someone that has planned 2 inauguration ceremonies, I know just how stressful that is. So there is a lot that he's going to have to take on and be tested very early on. And I think the key will be how he manages his relationship with the legislature as well to ensure that they are able to work together. But as we said, there are still some races that are too close to call, and we'll have to wait to see when that results come out in that final printout, just how the dust settles on some of those down ticket races.
Yeah, and we'll be interested to hear the current governor's analysis on everything that happened. He'll be joining us next week. It'll be his last appearance here on Spotlight Hawaii as the governor. We've appreciated all his time over the years of this program, so we'll look forward to his analysis of what was election night here in Hawaii. But on Friday, we're turning our focus to the economy. Paul Brubaker of TZ Economics, of course, a well-known voice in our community when it comes to analyzing the economy, is going to be joining us to give us a sense of what we can expect in the new year when it comes to Hawaii's economy and beyond. So we hope you do join us back here on Friday at 10:30. Until then, have a great day. Aloha.
Aloha. See you then.
This episode of Spotlight Hawaii is brought to you by Long's Drugs.